Hello, and welcome to the Just and Sinner podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper, and thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. I just want to make a couple of quick announcements before we get into our topic of the day. The first is we are a listener-supported organization, so please do consider giving to us. We are a 501c3 nonprofit as of just a few months ago, so that's an exciting development. We really do need your support to continue doing the things we do, so go to justandsinner.org, and you can become a contributor there on our donate page. Also, we've got a couple announcements to make about some things that have happened and are happening soon with our Widener Institute. The first is that we have an upcoming seminar with Dr. Nathan Greeley on St. Anselm's Doctrine of God. So we're going to be exploring what the medieval church did with the doctrine of God and talking about some of the issues that we're actually going to be talking about today. So it's $15 to sign up for that, be part of our live discussion. You'll get a video of that afterwards. So go to justandsinner.org and go to our upcoming events with the Widener Institute, and you can sign up and find out more info, as well as purchase videos of previous seminars and classes that we've done there. And then the second announcement that I wanted to make is also somewhat related to something we're going to be talking about today. And that is that our latest book in Revere Franklin Widener's complete work series has just been released. And that is his volume on biblical theology of the Old Testament. It's part of a series of a biblical theology of the Old Testament and biblical theology of the New Testament. And this predates the work, actually, of someone like a Geerhardus Voss. So we may be diving into that a little bit as we have a special guest with us today who I know has definitely has an interest in the subject of biblical theology. So I have with me today Dr. Lane Tipton. He's the pastor at Trinity OPC in Easton, Pennsylvania, and he is also the fellow of biblical theology and systematic theology with the Reformed Forum. So thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Tipton.
Jordan, thanks for having me. This is fun. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, so I'm glad we get to have this conversation today. Now, your name was brought up quite a bit after the last program I did on Van Til with Dr. Nathan Greeley, and he's part of a recent publication from the Davenant Institute, which is a critique of presuppositional apologetics and Van Tillianism. And the reason why, I think a lot of people reached out to me with your name was because a lot of the criticisms toward Van Til, and this is the issue that I've been concerned about, is in terms of what we call theistic mutualism and some of the developments in the doctrine of God kind of taking off from Van Til, or certain figures who are considered to be part of the legacy of Van Til or in that tradition. Yeah. And so people have reached out to me and said, you should talk to Lane Tipton, because he's someone who's both within that Van Tilian tradition and also is very much committed to a classical doctrine of God, or what we call classical theism. Yeah. So I'm really excited about this conversation today. We're going to be just kind of diving into some of these issues of what is classical theism, what is theistic mutualism, what are these debates. And I know a lot of my listeners have kind of seen parts of this a lot from what I've done, but that's more in the Lutheran tradition. So what I think we're going to see is that there are some very similar debates and similar discussions that are really occurring kind of throughout Christendom today on some of these issues. So with that, what I want to do is start with just a couple of basic introductory points. And I want to talk about kind of two figures here. One is Geerhardus Voss, who is a very influential figure within that tradition. And the other is Cornelius Van Til, who we're going to spend most of our time on. So some of my listeners who are more in the Lutheran tradition, or Anglicans maybe who haven't been as acquainted with the work of Van Til, are may kind of know the names, but not be sure exactly what these figures did. So if you could just give us first an introduction to who is Geerhardus Voss, and then maybe an introduction to who is Van Til, and then we'll get into some of the discussion from there.
Sure. Van Til studied theology in part at Princeton Theological Seminary. And when he was there, he studied under a number of old Princetonians. One of the ones that stood out and was Van Til's favorite professor was Geerhardus Voss. Voss taught biblical theology at Princeton Seminary, and Van Til was extremely indebted to him. Voss has recently had translated by Richard Gaffin, a 5-volume Reformed Dogmatics, so that you can get an introduction to the Reformed dogmatician Geerhardus Voss. But Voss was also a pioneer in the discipline of Reformed biblical theology. And the fundamental difference, I don't want to be too remedial for your listeners because I know they've heard a lot about this, there's interest there, but the basic difference between dogmatic and biblical theology is that dogmatic theology takes a topical approach to the teaching of all of the scriptures and looks at the logical relations among those topics. And biblical theology investigates the history of special revelation with an emphasis on studying the form in which revelation is given in its progressive, organic, supernatural, historical development. And Voss pioneered and brought to expression a reformed approach to biblical theology that sought to undermine the discipline that was pioneered by Gabler and the critical tradition. And the chief difference is that the critical German biblical theologians denied the self-contained character of God, denied his immutability, and reduced the Christian religion to principles of ethics. And Voss wanted to say, no, what you have in the history of special revelation are a series of supernatural revelations from a self-contained and immutable God that are administered covenantally, covenant of works pre-fall, covenant of grace after the fall. And after the fall, all of Revelation has a movement toward its climactic and consummate expression in the humiliation and exaltation of Christ and its implications. And Van Til, as a student of Voss, not only drank deeply from his Reformed dogmatic, similar to Pieper and Müller and the Lutheran tradition, a standard dogmatic presentation, but Van Til also drank deeply of the teaching of Voss, which spoke with equal emphasis of an absolute, immutable, and impassible and simple triune God on the one side, and this wonderful history of special revelation, covenantally administered on the other side. And so Van Til, after studying at Princeton, wound up moving to Westminster, where he taught apologetics for over 45 years. I believe his retirement dates are in the mid-70s. He passed away in 1987. And so from the Reform side, now this is for the Lutheran listener. On the Reform side, Voss and Van Til are not the only figures that are worth discussing, but they're two prominent and really important figures for understanding the development of confessionally reformed biblical and systematic theology in the 20th century. Of course, there are many others, Jordan, as you know, that we could talk about, but those two really stand out as unique, and the influence was was one of Voss as a mentor, and Van Til one of the disciples of Voss coming out of Princeton.
Yeah, I think what's so important about that, especially looking at someone like Voss, is that a biblical theology and a systematic or a dogmatic theology are not opposed to one another. And I think you get this bifurcation today. And I know the accusation largely from a lot of theologians who are in the camp of what we call theistic mutualism, and we'll get into kind of defining exactly what that term means. But a lot of individuals in that camp will kind of accuse systematic theology of being, abstract or Greek, or speaking about a static God and not being really attuned to the progress of revelation in Scripture and God really actively working within world history. So what I think is so important about that is you're pointing out that Voss is kind of the chief figure, at least in the Reformed tradition, who's really doing that with biblical theology, but he also is a dogmatic theologian. And I think we see similar things in the Reformed tradition as well. In the Lutheran tradition. I mentioned Reverend Franklin Widener, who, our institute is named after him. Yeah. And one of the things that I love about him is that he's got this 8-volume systematic theology, but he also has this multi-volume biblical theology. And so the best of theologians who are taking Scripture seriously both recognize that there is progressive revelation in history, and can do that in response to what are these historical critical schools or the history of religion schools or these other kinds of mindsets that are critiquing Scripture, taking Scripture seriously as the revelation of God, but also not historicizing God so that he is part of a historical process in such a way that God himself changes along with the history that is recorded in Scripture.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I remember when I first discovered Voss's biblical theology in the early 90s, and then began, as I moved towards seminary, to start to read of the developments from Gabler forward of so-called critical, post-Enlightenment, post-Kantian, what we'll just call it modernist biblical theology. One of the key arguments that those theologians make is that the study of the historical development of the unfolding of scriptural history is designed, in their view, to replace the dogmatic, Greek, speculative, abstract, philosophically motivated tradition of dogmatic theology. And both in Voss, especially from just the Reform side, what's so refreshing is that you see someone who is equally concerned to maintain a robust history of special revelation on the one side, but not in a way that competes with, mitigates against, or erases the immutable, self-contained triune God who is the author of that history, but rather enshrines him as central. And that work that you're referring to is that the biblical and systematic theology from the Lutheran side, that shows the difference between confessionally motivated theologians who understand the way these sweetly comply biblical and systematic theology, and the critical mutualist tradition that really wants to replace the Catholic and confessional expressions of the church with an entirely new way of theologizing that starts mutualizing God and the world in a single common evolving process. Very different.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is an issue that we're all facing in kind of all Christian traditions at this point. This is a battle that I think we're going to have to be fighting for a while. And I certainly think, at least, especially in the last century, what we call theistic mutualism has kind of taken the upper hand. In some ways, it's been taken for granted, and that is within confessional traditions. That's within broader evangelicalism. It has influence pretty much everywhere. And if you look at some of the debates in the Reformation era, if you look at the 17th century, for example, and you look at the Lutheran and Reformed and Roman Catholic scholastics, they're all kind of battling it out on different issues, but they're really not fighting on these grounds because they recognize that in terms of their basic conception of who God is, in terms of his simplicity, his immutability, they have the same conception. Now, and when they work that out and get into other doctrines, there are going to be the areas of disagreement. So we're kind of going back to ground level, I think, at this point. And I think it's good for us to kind of stand together on these issues and say, look, this has been a problem throughout Christendom. And I think we have to kind of come at this together and approach what are some really major issues. So let's talk about what theistic mutualism is, because we've used that term a few times, and some people may be more familiar with theistic personalism, which is Brian Davies' term. So let's kind of define the basics. What do we mean by theistic mutualism?
Well, there are a number of ways to try to get at it, but one way to try to describe what theistic mutualism is saying is this. Typically, mutualists will affirm that when you talk about the creator-creature distinction initially, just God in himself, that God is immutable, self-contained, simple, and all of the classical attributes are affirmed. Typically, even Karl Barth will go so far as to affirm them. But the problem is with mutualism is that when God relates to the creation, God in that relation enters into a process of development along with the creation so that both God and creation are in a common mutual process of self-actualization, of actualizing unactualized potential together in a common process of mutual evolution and development. And it's become, I think, particularly problematic since the Enlightenment, it's not an exclusively Enlightenment problem by any stretch of the imagination. All ancient heresies, at the end of the day, are mutualistic in character, I think, in one way or another. But particularly in 19th and 20th century, in the shadow of Kant and Hegel and others, that the what is affirmed in the creator-creature distinction is denied, in essence, in the creator-creature relation. And in so doing that, the divine and the human are commingled. The divine and the creaturely are commingled in various ways.
Right. So I think, looking back to the 19th century, as you said, this is really the rise of it is in the 19th century. But what happens, I think, uniquely in the 20th century is that even those within confessional traditions tend to adopt certain elements of it. As you go back to the 19th century, I think of a work by August Dorner, who has this, he's a Lutheran theologian, he's got this book on divine immutability. And he basically, argues that, we have this evangelical doctrine of justification. We have an evangelical soteriology, but what we really need is a Protestant theology proper too. We didn't go far enough. And so we kind of developed that theology proper in light of that. And what I think it was easy for those who are confessional at that time, both in the Lutheran Reformed traditions, to kind of recognize what the issues were. But what I see really is a shift in someone like Karl Barth and the rise of neo-orthodoxy, especially because you have someone who is much closer to orthodoxy, hence the name neo-orthodoxy, in many ways, who's fighting against what was the old liberalism that he was taught, but also bringing in some of these conceptions of God that I think are really problematic. And then that kind of ends up bleeding over into all sorts of theologies from that point forward. So let's talk a little bit about Barth. What's Barth's role in this? And then we'll get into Van Til, because he certainly is a critic of Barth in many ways. So what's Barth's contribution to these discussions?
Well, I would call Barth the chief architect of 20th century mutualism. That might be too strong. There may be some listeners who say, oh, come on, that's too strong. And I'm more than willing to on a side issue there, to have that debate. Is he the chief architect? But let's just call him one of the chief architects, just to save too much controversy there. And what Barth affirms is that in primal history or Geschichte, God wills himself to be submerged into the interiority of space-time contingency in what he calls the Christ event. And that interiority of contingency, Barth calls God's time for us, a third time, distinct from God's time, distinct from Adam's fallen time. In this third time, God and man come together and participate mutually in an event of becoming, which Karl Barth calls Jesus Christ, or the Christ event. And what that means is that both God and man come together and participate in a tertium quid, a third thing, something that's neither God in himself, nor something that is purely man in himself, but man comes to participate in God's becoming, and God participates in man's becoming, as the two are mutually constituted in an event by which they are enveloped in a common uniting time. They participate in it. And that, Jordan, your work, by the way, which I've just begun to look into, your work has convinced me that not only in the Reformed tradition, but also in the Lutheran tradition, this Barthian influence is just about ubiquitous. So the bottom line, Barth's contribution is that both God and man are subsumed in and made mutual participants in a common or third time, God's time for us in Jesus Christ. And if that's the case, God, once he relates primordially to the creature in this third time, he's no longer self-contained. He's no longer ase. He's no longer unconditioned and all-conditioning, immutable and impassible, but the same qualities that characterize the creature characterize God, as the two are enveloped in this common process. It's mutualism than which few greater have been conceived, I think.
Yeah, I think what you ultimately see from that, through Barth's influence into all sorts of areas of modern theology, is that, the incarnation is no longer seen as the self-revelation or the self-condescension of the immutable, simple, ase, triune God. Now it becomes constitutive of the triune God's identity.
Yes.
You see that in Wolfhard Pannenberg and his Christology, where the resurrection basically constitutes the divinity of the Son.
Yes.
Kind of retroactively. And you see it in a figure like, Robert Jensen, who's a very influential figure coming from Barth, who speaks about the Holy Spirit as God's future, God always being future to himself. So God is constituted by his own future and constituted by the Christ event. And I think from a Reformation perspective, at least how it's articulated, is this is a truly Christ-centered or a truly gospel-centered theology, because now we're defining everything by what is the Christ event, including God's own nature.
Yes, and what's so difficult and pernicious about that way of speaking is that God comes to need space-time factuality. God comes to need the historical process in order to actualize unactualized potential in himself. And so this really is Voss, Van Til, and I know that there are Lutheran dogmaticians who would say this as well. That really can become, and I think is perhaps the chief or cardinal theological sin, because what it does is it takes, if we talk about biblical theology, it takes the predicates of history, that it's progressive, organic, and developmental, and it ascribes the predicates of history to the mode of God's being, which is in becoming, so that it's no longer a discussion about the history of special revelation. It's about the historical constitution of God himself in time and through time and in need of time. And that is just, as far as I can see, from any historically creedal and reformed confessional perspective, that is fundamentally subversive of the basic religion of the creator-creature distinction and the creator-creature relation. It's a fundamental recasting of theology proper, as far as I can see.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's move from, we've got Barth and these figures who, those from a more confessional Protestant perspective say, okay, yeah, I know what's wrong with maybe a Wolfhard Pannenberg, or with, process theology, or, these others that may be easier to dismiss. But let's talk about the influence that it's had within the Reformed tradition, because I've done plenty of work talking about what I see as major errors in these same areas in terms of our doctrine of God within the Lutheran tradition, and even among those who consider themselves part of a confessional Lutheran tradition. So let's talk a little bit about what's gone on in the Reformed world. Now, I'm not going to ask you to, name names. We're not going to do that or anything like talk about specific people, but we're going to just kind of hit on what are some general trends. So within the Reformed tradition, and within, you could probably think of evangelicalism that has largely been influenced by the Reformed tradition in some ways as well. What have you seen in terms of where theology has shifted from this classical understanding to where we are today in terms of a theistic mutualism?
Sure. I tell you what, I think the Reformed tradition in various quadrants, they're small and fairly isolated, I think, but they struggle with what I'm going to call the problem of biblicism. And biblicism, I would conceive in this way, that it's a taking of biblical teaching, divorcing it from the developing creedal and reformed confessional tradition, a creedal and confessional history of interpretation, not looking at what Augustine and Calvin and others within the Reformed tradition, the Protestant scholastics, had to say about the God-world relation, and looking at phenomena in Scripture which speaks of the Spirit, for instance, in Genesis 1:2, hovering, or God walking in the spirit of the day, God calling out, Adam, where are you? God saying to Abraham in Genesis 22:16-18, now I know that you fear me. It's very, the trend, I think, among some Reformed who are influenced by biblicism and reason more like broad evangelicals, is that anthropomorphic language is taken literally to say that when God walks, he is and calls out to Adam, he doesn't know where Adam is. Or when he says to Abraham, now I know, it means that, well, before I didn't know. And here's the subtle point. The subtle point is that God is in a reciprocal relation to creation. And not only, here's the key, not only is his being in becoming, but so is his knowledge. He's coming to know new things as history unfolds. And the interior logic of it is this, that as he comes to know new things, he becomes and changes in a manner determined by his new knowledge. So his new knowledge drives the development of his being, which is in becoming. And that's unfortunate. Because I think the Reformed tradition historically has had a very different view of anthropomorphism. We can talk about it, but that's one general trend. And where's the influence coming from? Well, it's a strange thing. If you look at some open theist literature, I've often thought of open theists as providing something of a backdrop for the influence on some of the evangelical and reformed types who are influenced in this way, because some of the open theists will want to try to affirm a common attribute, a classical attribute package, as long as God isn't related to the world. But what does God do? He risks himself and sovereignly wills himself to be something other than he is, and takes on these additional accidental, mutable, creaturely properties that are the locus for the so-called anthropomorphic language in Scripture. Problem is that in taking this approach and in moving in this direction, the logic of anthropomorphism, which we could talk about later, Bavinck would say, forbids ascribing change to God. Anthropomorphism becomes equivalent to change in God. And I see that as a trend, because it appears to be what the Scriptures are saying, unless you give careful consideration to the whole of the biblical witness about how, for instance, James 1:17, how is it that the Father of heavenly lights, who gives every good and perfect gift, does not change like shifting shadows in his agency? I think a lot of your biblicist and evangelical types who are not thinking creedally and confessionally think, well, if God acts, God has to change in those acts. But texts like James 1:17, for instance, correlate giving with immutability, which entails impassibility as well. To paint it in the broadest strokes, I think that part of what the Reformed tradition in certain quarters struggles with is a species of biblicism that isolates and misunderstands biblical language due to a failure to understand that language within the developing Catholic and Reformed confessional tradition.
Yeah, and I think you point out some really, really key issues there. And one that sticks out to me at the beginning is this idea that, God, though he is in himself immutable, has taken on these attributes, or he has sovereignly or freely chosen to take these changeable attributes to himself. What you're essentially left with is a kind of incarnation of the triune God before the incarnation, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a kind of a two-nature theology proper, in a sense.
Precisely. That's precisely what it is. And in a view like that, instead of talking about the human attributes of the human nature that subsist in that nature, you start instead to talk about attributes of God that are mutable. Mm-hmm. Whereas orthodoxy has always spoken of mutable attributes belonging to the creature, but not to God, and certainly not in a kind of pre-incarnational act of condescension. Yeah.
Right. Really key. So let's talk about, Van Til, because as I've discussed Van Til some, and I'm no expert on Van Til by any means, but it has been the pattern that I've seen that many who are committed to the system of Van Til also are theistic mutualists of some kind. And, I know that you kind of will acknowledge that that's the case. So a couple things I want to ask is, one is, why do you think that this has happened specifically with the followers of Van Til? And then second, I want to spend some time looking at just what Van Til himself said on these relevant issues.
Sure. Let me say this. I think there's a tendency among some in the who want to hold to Van Til's theology to miss the deep and basic influences on Van Til. Um, Geerhardus Voss was, as we've said before, and by the way, I hate to do this. Danny will be mad at me, but this volume right here is really worth a read. Geerhardus Voss, Reformed Biblical Theologian, Confessional Presbyterian by Danny Olinger. It has a very helpful section which talks about Voss's influence on Van Til. And I've noticed in Greg Bahnsen affirms that Voss was the preeminent singular influence on Van Til, and other scholars of Van Til will affirm this, but I don't think they understand the programmatic significance of that influence. I think there's a deep underappreciation and lack of awareness of the influence of Voss on Van Til. And let me just make you just say two things that are related to that. One from Voss as a dogmatic theologian, one from Voss as a biblical theologian. In his Reformed Dogmatics, for those who are interested, volume 1, pages 177 through 178, and I promise I'm not going to read it, Voss talks about the fact that when God relates to creation in what he calls the new relation, effected by the work of creation, Voss says that the relation changes, the creatures in relation to God change, but there is no real change in God. God remains immutable and absolute. Here's the key: not simply behind the relation to creation, but concretely and specifically in that relation. This is a hallmark of Bavinck as well. And so the point is that Voss, as an influence on Van Til in his Reformed Dogmatics, emphasizes this, that in back of the historical dynamism that constitutes the created order stands an immutable triune creator. He's not just immutable prior to relating to the world logically, he's immutable in that relation, impassible and simple. There is no change either in the essence or in the persons of God in his relation to creation. That's something that was drilled deeply into Van Til through Voss, Bavinck, and others. It's inherent in the Protestant scholastic tradition, as you know so well. Secondly, we've done a little podcast. I've lost track of how long we've been doing it, Jordan. I think it's like 7 years now, on Geerhardus Voss's biblical theology. And one of the things that Voss keeps hammering on against the modernists is that in these installments of revelation, the principle of revelation in biblical theology is epochal, periodic. There are periods of revelation that move from Adamic to Noahic to Abrahamic, Mosaic, Davidic, and New. And there's more detail, but those are the fundamental movements. In those dynamic movements, Voss emphasizes over and over again that we are dealing everywhere with the absolute God of the covenant. So that a covenantal God is not a mutable God. A covenantal God is an absolute and triune God, remaining such not only in the alpha point of relating to creation and the work of creation, but at every point along the line in the history of special revelation. There's no intermingling of the properties that belong to the creation and the attributes that belong to God as God in his relation to creation. So, Jordan, I think that one of the fundamental reasons a number of scholars who are wanting to follow Van Til but wind up falling into the ditch of mutualism do so is they have not appreciated the Vossian influence on Van Til. And so for readers who are interested, and I know that there are a lot of Lutherans who might not, that you have a number of Lutheran listeners who might not know about this, but for those who are interested, Voss's Reformed Dogmatics, Volume 1, Voss's Biblical Theology, wonderful places to look and say, you know, if you want to see what captivated the young Van Til, what made his heart burn within him at Princeton, what motivated his work and the faith he was defending, you don't want to look exclusively, but you want to look preeminently to Voss. And that's just not, Bahnsen gives it one sentence in his, in the Van Til's apologetic in this volume, which is coming back into print soon, I've heard. But he doesn't develop that. And had he developed it more, I think it would have been, what could I call it? It would have potentially preempted departures from Van Til, which are more basically departures from Voss. And Voss showing himself here to be not only a biblical theologian of the highest order, but a proponent of the confessional theological tradition of the highest order.
Yeah, I think that's interesting that you point out Bahnsen's work and how influential that is, because I think most people probably do know Van Til through Bahnsen more than they do Van Til himself.
That's true.
And I think probably we can all confess that Van Til's probably not the clearest writer. I think he's difficult for a lot of people to navigate in some ways.
Yeah, I remember just along those lines, I studied, this is going to date me, Jordan, I'm starting to feel old. I guess the white in the beard shows it, right? But I studied under Bahnsen back in the 90s. When I became a Christian in 87, by 90, I was studying with him, and I studied with him until he died. I was studying under him while at Westminster, California. So I was getting Frame and Bahnsen at the same time, and then Klein and Strempel on one side. It was really nice. And Bahnsen, I think, is by far the clearest expositor of Van Til. But the problem with Bahnsen is that he doesn't, apart from this reader, he doesn't really exegete Van Til that carefully. He summarizes and applies him. And so if you're getting summaries and applications and remain one step away from primary sources, it can lead to misunderstanding on theological issues. I don't want to lay the blame at Bahnsen's feet, because Bahnsen would argue in Theonomy and Christian Ethics from the immutability of God to the immutability of the law of God, and wasn't himself moving in a mutualizing direction. But I do think that when you have people who are eager to apply Van Til without looking into the deep programmatic structures of the theologians who influenced him, as well as the deep theological structures of Van Til himself, then you can run the risk of pushing Van Til into a mutualism. And this is my little thesis for a segue here. I would say Van Til in the 20th century, among Reformed theologians, is the strongest critic of what he called correlativism and what by today's nomenclature we call theological mutualism. Amazingly, incisively, and programmatically critical of every form of correlativism and mutualism. It's almost the dominant, in fact it is, I would say, the dominant leitmotif of his work.
No, I think a lot of, I've spoken to quite a few people from Davenant, or people who have been involved in some of these conversations that are going on right now, who are very committed to classical theism. And I think their concern with Van Til, and I'd like to hear your response to this, and we're not going to get into the weeds of all the differences between Thomism and Van Til's conception, but if you could just give kind of a general response to the claim that because Van Til is not using these kind of classical categories that, say, the Protestant scholastics did, borrowed from Thomas and others, definitely going back prior to Thomas as well in many ways, that because he's kind of rejecting those ways of speaking and the use of classical philosophy, that therefore Van Til's philosophy lends itself to movements that are not founded within that kind of classical theistic tradition.
Yeah, here's a little volume that everyone would do well to get. Now, I'm old-fashioned. This is so bad. I don't own, there's a newer volume that has comments from, I can't remember if it's Scott Oliphant or Bill Edgar. I have the older edition of the Intro to Systematic Theology. And one thing that's really worth doing, just as a beginning point, is to go to chapters 15, 16, and 17, which in this edition are pages 194 to page 252 of the Intro to Systematic Theology. And Van Til begins his exposition of God by an exposition of the Westminster Confession of Faith. So what I think people can miss, especially if you're too quick to run toward Van Til's interaction with philosophers, like you find, for instance, in this book, A Survey of Christian Epistemology. This one's all old and beat up, but in this one, he's interacting with a lot of philosophers. But in the intro, he's beginning with creedal and confessional language and categories. And so what you find when you look at him in terms of his primary sources, he's quoting not only from the confession, but from the Hodges, from Bavinck. He makes references to Voss, numerous references to Calvin and Augustine. And when you take a kind of, oh, how can I put this? When you put it in the context of Voss's influence on him, look at what he's actually saying about the names and attributes of God, the essence and the persons of God. It's thorough. I mean, for those who really know the tradition well, it's almost boring in the sense that he's restating all of the classical theism that you would find in the old Amsterdam, old Princeton tradition, and he's taking his starting point in the confessional standards. And then once he does that, one of the things that's really interesting is in this volume here, the Intro to Systematic Theology volume. Now, listeners are going to be disappointed by this. I only have the page numbers from this edition. I don't have it from the new edition with the commentary. But he says this, and this is just one example, pages 212 and 213, and I won't read for long, Jordan, just a little brief snippet. He says, when God created the world by the determination of his will, there was no change in himself. When the second person of the Trinity became incarnate, there was no change in God. God gave the world existence alongside himself. He could do so just because he is the self-contained infinite being. Thus, the doctrine of the infinity of God, so far from leading us into pantheism, that, by the way, that language, think mutualism, that's Van Til's term for mutualism, is the best possible safeguard against it. Any attempt to safeguard the doctrine of God against pantheism by subtracting from the self-contained internal activity of God is foredoomed to failure. And so following Voss, and it's Voss who uses the language of pantheism. That's code language. When you read Voss and Van Til, whenever you hear pantheism or correlativism, think theological mutualism. But the point there, and I don't want to belabor it, is that if you posit change in either the essence or persons of God, then you're bound toward that Barthian tertium quid, whether it's time or history or contingency, whatever it is, you're bound to that third thing in which God and man participate so that God can be enabled to relate to man. But what Van Til's saying here, and what he learned from Voss and Bavinck, and what I think he shares with the broader confessional tradition of your own background, is that in the work of creation, the triune God no more participates in man's temporal becoming than man's temporal becoming participates in God's eternal being in the creator-creature relation. And I think it's if you miss just how thoroughly creedal and confessional Van Til is in his starting point, referring to the scriptures about an immutable Father giving good gifts without changing. If you miss that, I think it's very easy to fall into the error of mutualism. And the irony of it, Jordan, for me, and it's still a stunning irony, is that there has grown to be some mutualists in the name of Van Til who, if you go back and were to read Van Til carefully, I think he would be and is a strenuous militant critic of the very mutualism that might be set forth in his name or in the name of others, like Voss or Bavinck. Because if you implicate Van Til in mutualism, the extension of that argument is you must also make that claim about Voss, Bavinck, and the chief influences on Van Til.
Now, if you were going to maybe suggest to somebody who, wants to read more about this from the Reformed tradition, because we can talk so much about, I've talked plenty about the Lutheran tradition. I'm just curious, where would you point people to say, they want to get a handle on kind of what these controversies are, what's a good defense against theistic mutualism? Where would you point them to?
Well, I'm going to say a year ago. My memory's fading on me right now in terms of exactly what the month was. I'm thinking it was April of last year. No, pardon me. I believe April of this year. We had James Dolezal on, and James has written a couple of volumes, All That Is in God, and that is the most recent. And he catalogs some of the more recent expressions of, we could call it biblicistic evangelical mutualism. That's a nice, helpful survey, I think, of the decline of evangelical and some Reformed theologians into forms of mutualism. And I think that's a helpful way to get into it. I will say this, I'm not sure people know about this, but Camden said, Lane, you should mention this. I've just completed an 8-part course introducing the theology and apologetic of Van Til. And it's not designed exclusively to show that Van Til is not a mutualist. It's designed to just get you into the deep structures of Van Til's theology, to show how his Reformed theology drives his apologetic. But if you're interested in a resource that delves into Van Til himself, that's a helpful way of getting into some of those issues. And then in the reading material, I try to pick those places in Van Til's corpus where you can read Van Til himself speaking to the issues of the Trinity and immutability and covenant and common grace and antithesis and proof. And then I would say for the readers, it would do well from a Reformed standpoint. It would do you so much good to purchase or borrow Voss's Reformed Dogmatics and look at some of the theological formulations that are in back of what Van Til's trying to defend and develop, because that influence has been, how can I say this? I'm trying not to overstate, has been significantly underappreciated.
Yeah, and in those courses, now I didn't watch all of the lectures, but I did watch the ones you did on Van Til and his relationship to idealism, because I think that's really kind of a key part of some of the discussions surrounding presuppositionalism today. Specifically, is that question of what is, because Van Til at times does use at least some of the language of idealists.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So there's a discussion about how exactly Van Til relates to idealism. So I know in there you kind of give your criticism basically of the thesis that Van Til is to be kind of identified with idealism in one way or another, specifically with Kant. So maybe you could expand on that a little bit, just because we had, the last program I did was with Dr. Nathan Greeley, who's our fellow of apologetics. So he does a lot in the area of doctrine of God specifically, and how that relates to apologetics. So, I
wasn't able to listen to all of that, but
which is okay.
I'm aware that that's going on, and I don't want. Last thing I want to do is try to spark anything like a controversy on your show. So let me just put it this way, and I think this might be a useful way to get at it. I can understand. Let me just put it this way: I sympathize so much with people who are concerned about Van Til, based in part on recent scholarship from those who are Van Tilian who have drifted into mutualism and have confused people. My heart goes out. And so let me just put it this way. I think that if the fact that Van Til is robustly anti-mutualistic is an indication of where he stands on the issue of idealisms. Let me put it this way.
Yeah.
The great entry point for idealism is to say that God's mode of becoming is determined by incremental increases in knowledge and interpretation. If God is as the absolute, if God is in a process of gaining new understanding, if God is in a process of gaining a wider and more adequate interpretation of reality, then that is the underlying logic, the fundamental concern of absolute idealism, that the absolute grows in emotional, intellectual, and interpretive insight. And so, that new knowledge acquisitions drive the development of a being that is in a process of becoming, moving toward an omega point. Van Til's work, and that people can listen to the lectures and get more and then do some reading on Van Til. But Van Til's critique of idealism is that it's just that knowledge base growing, that interpretation of reality widening and becoming more comprehensive. It's just that commitment to a God who learns new things that introduces the idea that his being is constituted by that new knowledge, by that interaction with the created order. And Van Til's critique is that to the extent that you affirm that model, you are nothing more than a pragmatist. Why? Because the pragmatist, along with the absolute idealist, insists that if there is a deity, that deity has to be not only in a process of becoming, but a process of acquiring new intellectual and interpretive insight as that being develops and becomes and is incorporated with space-time particularity. And so when Van Til writes his dissertation, God in the Absolute, and when Van Til, some of the essays that he writes, interacting with even Bauman and others of his professors under whom he studied, he constantly comes back to the fact that the moment you allow for growth in the knowledge of God, you allow for growth in the being of God. Now, and I'll come at it one more direction so that it might be useful. One of Van Til's great concerns about Gordon Clark in the Clark controversy was that when Gordon Clark affirmed that there is a univocal point of divine and human knowledge, Van Til said, you have denied the creator-creature relation, the creator-creature distinction in this formulation. Why? Because God's being and God's knowledge are coterminous in Van Til's language. In other words, God is simple, and if you posit univocity with respect to divine and human knowledge, you posit univocity with respect to divine and human being. And so, not only in his critique of idealism, but in his staunch defense against Gordon Clark, what Van Til's doing is trying to maintain the best he knows how, utilizing the language that he uses for point of contact with the idealist. He's trying to show them that a developing knowledge that's determinative of being is the thing he thinks is most disastrous to the enterprise of Christian theology. So my most indirect way of putting it is that his robust maintenance of anti-mutualism and anti-correlativism is precisely what is underwriting his critique of all forms of idealism.
That specific point you point out in the Gordon Clark controversy, I think, is really helpful because it demonstrates a specific place where he's applying this in terms of univocity, which is one of the major issues that we're kind of trying to address.
Yeah. Outside of the idealist, see, it's just so I think it helps us maybe direct it to something that might not be quite as disputed right now for just a complementary point.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. What I would really like to see is kind of some more, talk between all those who are committed to this classical theistic conception of, what is the Catholic confession going back to the early church through the medievals into the Reformation confessions. I would love to see some more conversations with those who are of a more Van Tilian and those who are of a more classical approach. try to hash these out with the common understanding of who God is, right? Because I think that becomes, for many people, that becomes the key issue, right? And I think that becomes the stumbling block in terms of Van Til and presuppositionalism.
Yeah, it really, I understand, and
Yeah.
that's why it's so important for us to realize that, Van Til is of that creedal and confessional stock that you find in the Westminster Standards, the high point of scholastic theological reflection, and is a follower and son, as it were, of Geerhardus Voss, and deeply indebted to Bavinck as well, and the Hodges. So yeah, really, what I would love to do is say Van Til's not a biblicist aiming for innovation, a mutualist doing his theology in the corner. Van Til is an heir and defender of creedal and confessional orthodoxy, and these considerations we've had today are a first step in that direction, and I would love for that to become more and more the way people think about Van Til, so that then we can talk, in addition to this theological ontology, about how it bears on the creator-creature relation. How does it bear on the image of God? How does it bear on covenant? How does it bear on the resurrection? How does it bear on the sacraments? And have some good constructive discussions, brother. I would love to see it, but I think it all begins by giving a robust 9 to all forms of mutualism, and situating Van Til against the deeper modernist conception of Barth, the idealism of his day, and any kind of biblicistic mutualism among evangelicals today.
Yeah.
I think Van Til would rise up and just give a passionate no to that.
Yeah. Yeah, and hopefully more of these kind of conversations can happen. I think that's the goal.
Well, thank you. And I just want to say I've really appreciated the work that you've done, highlighting the scholastic, the work of some Lutheran scholastics, and pointing out the problems of mutualism in your own tradition. It's something that I'll continue to pray for the Lord to bless, because it's something that I do think needs to be rooted out and exposed, because it is destructive of confessional religion.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It is. It's a major issue everywhere, as I've said, and it does kind of have different forms within the Reformed and Lutheran traditions, but I think the same underlying issues are there. And in both of our traditions, if you go to our most basic confessions of faith, the Augsburg Confession affirms divine simplicity. The Westminster Confession of Faith affirms divine simplicity, and in very clear language. And I think when you look at the mutualists, it really is, simplicity kind of becomes the foundational point, I think, that is attacked.
Yeah, it's it and all that it entails.
Yes,
is attacked. Yeah.
Yes, and so when you affirm simplicity, in a way, you affirm the whole thing, right? When you affirm simplicity, you're affirming immutability, and you're affirming all of the other aspects, impassibility. We can talk about the other attributes of God, but those things that are generally wrapped into that package that is classical theism.
Yeah, and you can maintain the absoluteness not only of the essence of God, but of the Trinitarian persons who relate to creation, which is one strategy of mutualists, is to say maybe there is some kind of essence back there that doesn't change, but the persons change. But a proper understanding of simplicity and doctrine of subsistence, where each person subsists distinctly as the entire undivided essence of God, nips that right in the bud.
Yeah, and I think what you see is, you've mentioned this, and we're kind of getting close to the end of our time. But if you could just kind of share, because I can give my perspective from a Lutheran view, which is, the question of what else does this affect, right? The doctrine of God, when this shifts, when we have a theistic mutualist conception of God, how does that change other doctrines? And within the Lutheran tradition, for example, we've seen that this really especially impacts how the law is viewed. Because in classical theology, it's been understood that the law is eternal, in that the law is a reflection of God's own character. And the law becomes divorced from God in some ways, but in other ways it becomes a kind of part of God for some modern theologians that has to be overcome by God's own love. And so this ends up wreaking havoc with all sorts of things, like the atonement, for example. because if the law is not eternal, if it is not a reflection of God's own perfect nature, and if God has to be just, if he doesn't have to be in accord with his own law, then the atonement is not a necessity in the sense that it is for classical theology.
Yes,
Um,
that's excellent.
so what, and that's that's the real heart of the gospel right there when we're talking about the atonement and the work of Christ. So where do you see this playing out in the Reformed tradition to kind of end here?
Sure.
Yeah.
I see it primarily playing out in a deviant and unhelpful theology of covenant, and let me explain. In mutualized conceptions of covenant, covenant is an ontological act of condescension by which God takes accidental mutable properties to himself so that he can interact with the mutable contingent creature. So covenant becomes that tertium quid in which both God and man participate in a common event of mutual becoming. It's kind of like Barth's Geschichte, except it's shifted to covenant. So think Geschichte gets shifted to covenant, and you have the mutualized conception of covenant. But in the Reformed confessions, the act of creation by which God relates to Adam, as Voss makes clear, Bavinck makes clear, Van Til makes clear, the confession makes clear, God remains immutable, impassible, absolute, and simple in relation to image-bearing Adam, who is a creature from the dust. Then, in not an act of creation, like the mutualists say about covenant, but in an act of special providence, God enters into covenant with Adam to offer himself to Adam as Adam's blessedness and reward on condition of perfect, personal, exact, and entire obedience to the terms of the covenant. And that act of special providence doesn't mutualize Adam and God in a common event of becoming. It simply offers to Adam the consummation of his natural religious fellowship with the immutable, self-contained, and impassible and simple triune God. And so the thing that's so concerning about mutualist theology from the Reformed side is it's a fundamental recalibration, rethinking, and fundamental permutation, fundamental change of what we mean by covenantal condescension. And it turns covenant into an ontological conception where God and man participate in a common event of becoming, rather than simply being the revelation of God by which Adam's natural religious fellowship with the self-contained and immutable triune God can consummate. Very different conceptions, and we have to do everything we can do on the Reformed side to maintain classical covenant theology against what I would call a revisionist conception of covenant among the mutualists.
Yeah, so it makes sense that you'd have that answer in terms of how this affects covenant, and as a Lutheran, I go to how this affects law and gospel, right? Because those are kind of the two key categories for us. So
absolutely.
But what you see, I think, why this is so essential and why I wanted to end there is because it shows that this is a practical issue. And this issue can sound very abstract to a lot of people. And, the average person in the pew can say, what in the world is this debate even about? What does even divine simplicity mean? Because, it's generally one of those ideas that's considered a bit abstract or philosophical. Right. But I think what's so clear is that how you view God has such a practical impact on how you view everything else.
Amen. And you can't preach. This theology of God is both when it comes to law and gospel, when it comes to covenant, it's this theology that preaches and is so vital for the church to hear. Yeah. So it's encouraging. Blessings as you continue to do your work, brother.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. As we sign off here, I'll let you give a plug if you want for anything you're doing, or places where people can find you if they want to see more of your work.
Oh, the only thing I would say is if this discussion interests, go to reformedforum.org. I don't do this very well. And then there are just myriad resources that you can find there, including a course on Van Til that I've done recently, but so much more from so many other brothers there. Reformed Forum is the place to go.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being on. And thanks everybody for watching or listening.